Before we get into the show, it's time for a Patreon shout-out. Shout out to Jill for signing up at the Telltale Hearts tier. If you would also like to support the show with money to get your own shout-out, access to bonus episodes, and a postcard club at the higher tiers, head over to patreon.com/drearymidnight. And now, let's get into the show. Baltimore American, July 5th, 1897. Some time ago, the wife of E.S. Shue was found dead in her home. A coroner's jury rendered a verdict: death by heart disease. Neighbors were not satisfied. The woman's body was exhumed, and her neck was found broken. Shue was indicted, convicted, and sentenced to the penitentiary for life. The principal evidence was that of Shue's mother-in-law, who testified that her daughter's spirit had come back to her and had said Shue had killed her by breaking her neck. All the other evidence was purely circumstantial. Tonight, on the Dreary Midnight podcast, we're doing the case of the Greenbrier Ghost. The only time a ghost's testimony has been used in an American murder trial, at least to my knowledge. My name is Lisa, my pronouns are she, they. Let's get into it. January 1897, Greenbrier County, West Virginia. Erasmus Shue, who goes by Trout for some reason, lived with his wife Zona in the collection of buildings known as Livesey's Mill. Trout was a blacksmith. The couple had only moved to the town after their wedding in October of 1896. He was allegedly 29, she was around 22 or 23. Trout was actually around 35 if his old marriage records are to be believed. Apparently Trout wanted 7 wives, of which Zona was the third. His first marriage was to Allie Esteline Cutlip and lasted 10 years, most of which was spent with Trout behind bars for horse theft. After the divorce, Allie alleged Trout was abusive. This union produced one child, a daughter. The second marriage was to Lucy Ann Tritt. It did not last nearly as long. Lucy died mysteriously within the year. Folks in that community were suspicious of Trout's behavior in the aftermath of Lucy's death as well, but he was never formally charged with anything. But whatever Trout did or did not do to his second wife, he moved to the Livesey's Mill area of Greenbrier County in the fall of 1896. Zona fell hard for him. They were married within weeks of Trout's arrival in town. On the morning of Saturday, January 23rd, 1897, Trout was at work at the blacksmith shop. He asked local child Andy Jones to run to the Shue household to ask if Zona needed any errands run. It was a Saturday, and Trout was already in town. It was common enough to have the local children run errands for the adults. Seems like phones hadn't quite caught on yet, so it wasn't unheard of for Andy to run a message like this. When Andy arrived at the Shue household, he found Zona's body at the bottom of the stairs. She was dead. Andy ran and found his mom, Martha. It took an hour for Dr. Knapp to arrive to do the medical examination. By that point, Trout had arrived at his own house and had moved Zona's body upstairs to the bedroom. He had put fabric around her neck, like a lot of fabric, like a conspicuous amount of fabric. He made a giant bow out of it and everything. Now, if this were a crime scene, he's not supposed to move the body. You know, leave it where it is to make sure all the evidence can be gathered. But, okay, fine, maybe it wasn't a crime scene yet. Because, well, all we know for sure is that Zona's body was at the bottom of the stairs. So they don't know for sure yet that it's a crime scene. And Dr. Knapp had been treating Zona for an unnamed condition, possibly related to pregnancy or the complications therein. Maybe everyone believed Trout was truly sad about Zona's death. He was making a show out of crying over Zona's body and cradling her head. And when Dr. Knapp arrived for the medical examination, the fabric was all still there. And Trout would not let Dr. Knapp go anywhere near her head or her neck. He would not move the fabric, he would not move her head. He stood at Zona's head the whole time and held it in place and wept hard when the doctor went anywhere north of her neck. And, well, since he couldn't go anywhere near the neck, Dr. Knapp had to wrap up and leave. Now, sources differ on what Dr. Knapp actually put down as the cause of death. Some said it was everlasting faint and then changed it to childbirth. The Baltimore American said it was death by heart disease. Point is, death by strangulation was not initially listed on the death certificate. Not initially, anyway. On January 28th, the following Thursday, Zona's obituary was listed on page 3 of the Greenbrier Independent. It read, Mrs. E.Z. Shue, wife of E.S. Shue, died in the Richlands, this county, on Sunday last, the 24th inst., aged 22 years. Mrs. Shue was a daughter of Mr. Hedges Hester of Meadow Bluff District. She formerly lived in this county. In the days and weeks after Zona's death, her mother prayed and meditated and thought and prayed some more for answers about Zona's death. At some point after January 23rd, though, Zona appeared as a ghost to her mother, Mary Jane Hester. According to Zona's spirit, Trout was angry that Zona did not have any meat cooked for supper and strangled Zona to death. Mary Jane had been praying and hoping for some sort of answer, and it seemed like that her prayers had finally been answered. There were a total of 4 visits from Zona's spirit. The first night, Zona's spirit didn't say anything about the circumstances of her death, though Mary Jane definitely asked. Zona appeared in the same dress she was wearing the day she died. It gave her mother directions to a square log house where, presumably, Zona and Trout lived. According to court testimony from Mary Jane Hester, and she told me where I could look down back of Aunt Martha Jones's in the meadow in a rocky place, that I could look in a cellar behind some loose plank and see. It was a square log house, and it was hewed up to the square, and she said for me to look right at the right-hand side of the door as you go in, and at the right-hand corner as you go in. Well, I saw the place just as exactly as she told me, and I saw blood right there where she told me, and she told me something about that meat every night she came, just as she did the first night. She came 4 times and 4 nights, but the second night she come, she told me that her neck was squeezed off at the first joint, and then it was just as she told me. Mary Jane Hester had never been down to Zona's cabin before that, but in June of 1897, Mary Jane went and saw exactly what Zona said would be there. With this information, and the sort of community support that came with Trout being kind of a human asshole anyway, Mary Jane insisted that Zona's body should be exhumed and examined for any additional details. And, well, what do you know? There's the exact circumstances described by Zona's spirit. A broken neck, and bruising, and evidence of manual strangulation, especially around the first joint. The case went to trial starting June 22, 1897. Messrs. Gilmer and Preston represented the state of West Virginia, and Joseph P.D. Gardner and Dr. Rucker appeared for the accused in West Virginia versus E.S. Shue. This is where Mary Jane gave her testimony about seeing Zona's spirit. It's a pretty long testimony, and all reported in Greenbrier Independent on July 1st. One of the defense attorneys asks, I have heard that you had some dream or vision which led to this post-mortem examination. Mary Jane says, they saw enough themselves without me telling them. The defense attorneys asked Mary Jane Hester in at least 8 different times, in at least 8 different ways, are you sure this was not a dream? It got to the point where the attorney just said, now I would like, if I could, to get you to say that these were 4 dreams and not 4 visions or appearances of your daughter in flesh and blood. And Mary Jane said, I am not going to say that, for I am not going to lie. Mary Jane also testified she had never been down to the Shue property before following Zona's instructions that one time. She testified she truly believed Zona was corporeal at the time of her appearances, and according to the court testimony, it would be hard to see the exact blood splatters in the Shue household if one wasn't looking for them. And well, Trout was suspicious anyway. Well, look at his behavior after Zona's death and the discovery of her body. If the timeline works out, Zona may have been killed the night before, when there was no meat for supper. The morning of January 23rd, maybe Trout stationed her body at the bottom of the stairs. Maybe that's just where she fell. I could not find a layout of their house or an official timeline, so I don't know what the positioning or the timeline for sure would have been. Either way, it seems deliberate that Trout sent Andy Jones back to the house to find the body and establish an alibi. After all, if Trout is acting normally for a Saturday morning, he gets the news at work, people see him at work, that throws the suspicion off of him. But look at his behavior around Zona's body. He kept protecting her neck and head, even in the coffin and the casket during the funeral and the wake. He kept adding pillows and scarves and fabrics, and had her buried in a high-necked dress that was allegedly her favorite. He cried and stood by Zona's head every time the casket was opened. The undertaker only provided the coffin, and not the actual preparation of the body for burial. It's almost as though Trout did not want anyone else to see the bruising around the neck. But in July of 1897, he was found guilty of first-degree murder. The jury deliberated for an hour and 10 minutes, according to the Greenbrier Independent, and recommended that his punishment should be life in the state penitentiary. Much of the evidence is circumstantial. Maybe Trout didn't actually strangle Zona. Maybe there was some other health condition that was hard to diagnose in 1897, or could only be diagnosed as an everlasting faint. But it seemed deliberate. Standing by the neck, hiding the possible wounds, all of that. And maybe Mary Jane Hester knew something more than she let on. Maybe she could glean more information from sporadic talks with her child during that child's life. Or maybe she just thought of the ghost conceit because of something else. See, in that January 28th edition of the Greenbrier Independent, there was another article on an Australian case, which was later called Fisher's Ghost, though it may not have been called that at the time. The paper read, "One of the most famous murder cases in Australia was discovered by the ghost of the murdered man sitting on the rail of a dam, Australian for horse pond, into which his body had been thrown. Numberless people saw it, and the crime was duly brought home. Years after, a dying man, making his confession, said that he invented the ghost. He witnessed the crime, but was threatened with death if he divulged it as he wished to, and the only way he saw out of the impasse was to effect to see the ghost where the body would be found. As soon as he started the story, such is the power of nervousness that numerous other people began to see it, until its fame reached such dimensions that a search was made and the body found, and the murderers brought to justice." I mostly mention that for its similarities to Mary Jane Hester's testimony. Because, well, that article about the Australian ghost was on page 1, and Zona Shu's obituary was on page 3. I'll link the paper in the show notes. Mary Jane may have read it, she may not have. She may have just kept page 3, who knows. But the Australian case was not a major headline, and there aren't many photos in old newspapers, so it wasn't as if it was made a huge deal of in the paper. But there was a really good summary from the Greenbrier Independent on July 8th, 1897, that summarizes the trial. Sums it up best, so I'll leave you with this. After the murder, Shu had every opportunity to make his escape, as 4 weeks elapsed before he was arrested and put in jail. The fact that he did not do so was explained by Mr. Gilmer, the attorney, in his argument, by showing that Shu was all the time laboring under the impression that he could not be convicted on circumstantial evidence, and felt secure in knowing that there was no witness but himself to the crime. This, Mr. Gilmer argued, showed not a lack of sense but information, and accounts for Shu's presence at the inquest and his oft-repeated mark that they could not show he did it. Taking the verdict of the jury as ascertaining the truth, then we must conclude that Shu deliberately broke his wife's neck, probably with his strong hands, and with no other motive than to be rid of her, that he might get another more to his liking. And, if so, his crime is one of the most horrible, cruel, and revolting ever known in the history of this county. And that, my friends, is the case of the Greenbrier Ghost. The only case where a ghost's testimony was taken in evidence at a murder trial. When I was initially researching this, just sort of as a side note, when I was initially researching this, I kept calling this spectral evidence because I thought that's what it was. I googled the term when writing this up just to make sure I was using it correctly, and I was not quite using it correctly. But it sort of ties in, so I wanted to mention this anyway. The only other time that I know of that spectral evidence was used in any sort of court of law was in the courts of Quarrier and Termiter in the Salem witch trials. See, spectral evidence is that an accused person's spirit shows up to a witness in a dream while the accused person is in a different location. It, again, was mostly used in witch trials, where being accused of witchcraft often comes with the assumption that one can project one's spirit. Even if the accused witch was not projecting their spirit, the devil may be doing so in their stead. And some theologians thought, at the time of the Salem witch trials, that an innocent person could not be impersonated by the devil, so damned in several different ways. After the Salem witch trials, spectral evidence was outlawed, at least in that jurisdiction. For spectral evidence to have happened in the case of the Greenbrier Ghost, it would have had to have been Trout's spirit projecting to Mary Jane Hester's dreams. It would not have been Zona appearing. I bring that up because I think maybe the defense attorney was trying to get Mary Jane to say it was a dream in order to make the spectral evidence argument. Because spectral evidence is no longer a valid form of testimony, and therefore the star evidence needed to be struck from the record, and therefore Trout gets off. So that's a tangent there. I hope you enjoyed. That's all I have for you tonight. If you want to get in touch with the show, follow us on Instagram at Dreary Midnight Pod. Write an email with suggestions, questions, comments, concerns, fear, hopes, dreams. DrearyMidnightPodcast@gmail.com. If you want to support the show with money, donate to the Patreon, patreon.com/DrearyMidnight. Until next time, stay away from people willingly calling themselves Trout. Do not marry a horse thief that wants 7 spouses on purpose, and safe travels home on this dreary midnight. Good night.